Chapter 10. There lay in Newgate a very famous felon whose days were drawing to a close. Indeed, on this Wednesday, there was less than a fortnight's life left in him. On Tuesday, January 23rd, Dick Mulroon was to be taken out and hanged. A great many petitions had been got up to save him, but none had succeeded, and no one in his heart of hearts was truly sorry. For the death of a hero, even though he was a murderous ruffian, was a vastly romantic thing. From morning to night there was a press of carriages outside the jail, for Mr. Mulroon had more friends and admirers than he knew what to do with. They came to see him, to talk with him, even to drink with him, and then go away and brood on the frailty of human life. Mr. Mulroon's not their own. Even great ladies came and went, their huge skirts swinging and pealing down the doleful passages like so many brocaded bells tolling. What a pity, what a shame. Dick's to die on Tuesday week. What a pity, what a shame. Poor Mr. Mulroon. So it was that Smith and his bitterness and bewilderment with all the world dropped into Newgate with no more stir than a driblet of spittle into the Fleet Street ditch. True, the jailer at the lodge had been surprised when he discovered that the undersized object in livery was Smith. Not old Smith, he'd said with a shrug and a grin. Not grubby little Smith. Thieving Smith. Smith o' the doorways and corners. Smith o' the stinking Red Lion. Then he thrust his reeking bristly face close and remarked on Smith's cleanliness and said he'd never suspected his features were so human. But washing ain't exactly been profitable, eh? For your dirt, Smith hid a multitude of sins, and now them sins is exposed to the view. So here you are, me lad, jailed, jugged and bottled, as we say in the trade. But when he learned the charge was murder, he withdrew somewhat and said reproachfully, "Ah, now, Smith, that's bad. Poor Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget, when they comes to alter them clothes, why, they'll wash 'em with their tears." Smith was lodged in the Stone Hall, but was spared fetters on account of Mr. Billings having paid the jailer the necessary dues, which charitable act had been accompanied by a whispered, "Don't take it too hard, lad," and a look as deep as the ocean. Then the Stone Hall was locked, and Smith was, for the first time, a resident in it and not a visitor, which was a dark and lonely time for him. Though he'd been shut in the Stone Hall as a kindness, there being worse places in the jail where he might fairly have been lodged, he dreaded meeting the old acquaintances now his circumstances were so come down. He shrank from Mr. Palmer and his friends, for he remembered burningly that he'd last departed from them with some defiance, being on his way up in the world. Mercifully, he was spared Mr. Palmer's sneers and scorn. The gentleman was otherwise engaged. Indeed, all the superior debtors were, at that time, too full of Dick Mulroon's grand visitors to spare a glance for the dismal, fearful, pallid child who crept from corner to corner like a persecuted ghost. The only soul to pay him any heed had been an old man who'd not seen daylight for 15 years. This queer old fetid bird slept in the fireplace all the year round, save on Christmas Day when the fire was lit, when that, with much good-natured laughter, they shovelled him out, and had come to resemble a dusty ember. He beckoned Smith over with 4 or 5 sharp gestures, and offered to share his strange nest. Salubrious, he said it was, owing to a good down-draught from the chimney. With a clank of his fetters, he pointed upward to the ragged black hole, and declared that sometimes a star might be seen, twinkling away like it was sat on Newgate's roof. It ain't so bad, little sparrow. You get used to it. Though we never sees the sun, we never gets doused by the rain neither. And it's a comfort to know you're in the worst place in the world, so you've naught more to fret and slave about to keep yourself from falling lower. For you've arrived. Then he settled back on his haunches and appeared to doze off, leaving Smith to stare up into the darkness. From time to time, the old man, now sunk into a nesting coil, would twitch and jerk in a curious fashion, bringing his chained wrists together and thumping them down as if a hated head on a hated head. This done, he'd sigh and settle down once more into a contented sleep till the next time. Smith shivered and wondered if the old man, too, had his Billing and Mansfields to plague his very sleep. Smith had come to hate the Mansfields more even than he hated Mr. Billing. Once he'd admired and even loved them. He'd respected them and trusted them. He had, so to speak, made great exports from his heart towards them and had reasonably expected some sort of return. But at the first squall they defaulted, bankrupted Smith, and left him in a state of blind rebellion. If ever Mr. Billing was able to get him out of the jail, Smith would make it his business to take a good revenge on the saints of Vine Street. This resolution, in part, calmed him, though the mystery that clung about Mr. Billing, the document, and worst of all, about the unseen man with the limp, remained as dark and menacing as ever. Next day, at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Smith had visitors, Miss Bridget and Miss Fanny, and was both pleased and surprised. How had they learned so soon? Miss Bridget sighed bitterly and remarked that bad news travels quick. While it took 3 weeks to learn that Smith was going up in the world, it took about the same number of hours to discover he was come down. And a common jailer had to tell us. Oh, the shame of it, the degradation. Dismally, Smith picked at his brass buttons and neat coat. Fine clothes and a clean face are but the trappings of shame, went on Miss Bridget with a furious sorrow. When the child what has them is so degradingly jugged. Oh, I never done it, said Smith. You know I never done it. You're here, ain't you? Said Miss Bridget unhappily. That speaks volumes, don't it? You done something. I was wrongly accused, victimised, said Miss Fanny. Innocence is no excuse in the eyes of the law, smut dear. That much your sisters know. They stared at him angrily and tragically, while he looked back with as much of defiance as he could manage. Then Miss Fanny, as was her nature, thought of a brighter side. She sighed and poked at her remarkable hat, for whenever the sisters came out of their cellar, they dressed very grandly indeed, as an advertisement for their taste and skill. Leastways, 'tis lucky you had picked on such a time to get nabbed, sweet, for with dear Dick Mulroon in residence, the tone goes up, don't it? My, but there's fashion and elegance coming and going. Don't you think, Brid? 'Twill do our smut good to be mixing with such gentility. As I always said, 'tis an ill wind that don't blow the silver lining out of the dreariest cloud. She sipped gently at her gin. They were in the tap room and made a face. Miss Bridget, who was drinking ale, put down her pot and looked at her sister scornfully. Much good his gentility will do him when that disgusting Mr. Jones has done with him. It's his clothes that will be coming down our steps with no boy inside of them, Fanny. And have you thought, sister, what it'll cost to have possession of him for to bury him proper and decent? Or would you have him be took off to Surgeon's Hall to be bottled for all the world to jeer at? Miss Fanny shivered and shook her head, and then she murmured, Oh, smut, dear, if only you'd given up the document when Lord Tom asked, and then there'd be no Surgeon's Hall, no Mr. Jones, nor even them two fierce gents in brown. Did they come back then? Muttered Smith, coming out of his pint pot of ale, where he'd been hiding his face while his sisters disposed of his remains. Yes, they'd come back, and back again. They'd haunted the Red Lion for several days, a terrible pair with eyes like burning coals, though the taller of them, said Miss Fanny, might have been more presentable if he'd been on the snaffling lay instead of on the sneaking, throat-slitting budge. Here Miss Bridget remarked that Miss Fanny's language was as bad as her low-class friends', to which Miss Fanny said gently that she liked to find good in everyone, and that, had it not been for dear Lord Tom, the villains in brown might still have been there. He took them on one side, smut, and spoke to them so fierce that they never been back since that moment. Then Miss Fanny went off into a melancholy memory of how cheered they'd been to get the good news, which had the effect of disheartening Smith into miserable tears. Round about them the dregs of the town ebbed and shuffled and flowed in ever-changing groups and pairs, sometimes eyeing Smith and his visitors with sneering curiosity, but more often discussing the latest news of doomed Mulroon. Smith's fireplace companion alone seemed to keep his interest. He crouched but 2 yards off, with his head on one side and his old, bleared eyes quite sharp, like an ancient parrot. Contrary to her usual habit, Miss Fanny saw no good in him at all, but shuddered to the depths of her soul whenever his old eyes caught hers. At length, to Smith's great pleasure and pride, Lord Tom joined them. He'd come from paying his respects to his old comrade-in-arms, Dick Mulroon. He wore a melancholy, romantic air, like a new green cloak, and seemed to swirl it from the tips of his ragged eyelashes to the ends of his powdered-stained fingers. "Well, smart, me lad. Alas, it seems you've forestalled me. Not lost, but gone before, eh?" He sighed. "Oh, me boy, you'd go in good company, the best in the world, for though I'm a flinchly common man and poor Dick's a Hounslow Heath boy, I gave him best. The grandest of the roisterers, the gayest, dashingest, noblest of us all. He's in good spirits, lad. Ha ha! The best! For he's drunk as a lord." "Disgusting," muttered Miss Bridget, and drew her discreet finery as close to her person as her hoops allowed. Lord Tom sat back with a Toby-sized sigh, and his glittering eyes roamed the stinking, shadowy, shuffling room with a touch of compassion. Or was it only dread? Smith looked very piteously from his sisters to his grand friend, and the world seemed, even in the stone hall, too fair a place to be leaving after so few years in it. Suddenly Lord Tom's eyes flickered, as if some distant shade had provoked a thought. He bent forward to his small friend. "But we'll see, me fine lad. Yes, we'll see. While there's life, there's hope, as we say on the lay. Maybe Mr. Jones won't have you yet a while. Maybe Lord Tom can help." Smith, though not convinced, was sensible of Lord Tom's aim to be cheerful. He looked up with a mournful smile. "How, Lord Tom? That document, young fellow, do you have it still?" "Not with me, Lord Tom." The highwayman looked doubtful, then brightened again. "But do you know where it lies?" "That I do, Lord Tom. And given certain circumstances, such as you might know best, could you lay your hands on the aforementioned property?" "That I could, Lord Tom." "And would you, me boy?" "That I would, Lord Tom, with all me heart." "Then we'll see, will me bright young heart." Dark though these matters may be, while Lord Tom's about, there's yet a ray of light. Lord Tom spread out his strong arms to escort Miss Fanny and Miss Bridget away. One arm was took, but the other was left, like an empty bracket. Miss Bridget had no need of support. She fidgeted with her hands, and then, with a strange timidity, stretched out and fleetingly touched Smith's sunken head. "Be back tomorrow, you felonious child. Just remember, though you be not so good as you ought, you ain't forget, dear. Fan and me'll be back." When Smith raised his head, they were gone, but on the table beside his empty pot was a guinea. Which one had left it? Smith scratched his head and looked to the old man, who seemed to have gone off into a dozy brood. The old man yawned and his eyes flickered. "Ah, me sparrow, that would be telling, wouldn't it? Which one cares a guinea's worth? The pigeon, the starling, or that seedy hawk? Hee! It's worse than not knowing who's done you an injury, not knowing who's done you a kindness. It's horrible not knowing who to thank." But before Smith could abuse the old man, another visitor came quickly towards him. He and Smith's earlier visitors must have crossed paths without knowing it. It was Mr. Billing. But before Smith could abuse the old man, another visitor came quickly. He wore black, which gave his complexion an oddly high, artificial air. The old man looked at him uneasily and then clanked farther off, as if anticipating the attorney's wish. He turned his bony head and seemed to absorb himself in a corner. "Well, lad," murmured Mr. Billing, sitting down and fingering the guinea idly, "as you see, I've not forgot you." "No, Mr. Billing," muttered Smith, watching his money being scratched at by a neatly polished claw. I don't suppose you have. And I've not forgot you, Mr. Lying Billing, Mr. Murdering Billing. Not till Mr. Jones turns me off up the road will I forget you. And if there's such a thing as ghosts, Mr. Conniving Billing, there'll be a screaming, shrieking ghost awaiting you for every night of your life when you goes to bed. The attorney looked momentarily taken back by the force of Smith's gloomy hate. Was it possible he hadn't expected it? I'm not a bad lot, you know. I live in the world, so to speak, and can't help being of it. Take me all in all, I'm no worse than anyone else. Believe me, young man, you'll come to see that. Life's a race for rats, and its devil take the hindmost and foremost, and the one in the middle. We're all rats, Smith, and it's eat or be eaten. Blame nature if you like, but don't blame me. Having delivered himself of this, Mr. Billing contrived to look oddly wistful, as if he wished the world were constituted otherwise, and he might then be an honourable man, as could be met with in a month of Sundays. Smith looked up at him dubiously, but couldn't help observing that no matter what melancholy sincerity there was in the attorney's face, his fingers continued to play with the guinea like a cat with a fledgling bird. All right then, sighed Mr. Billing at length, administering a final tap to the coin and blinking his stony eyes. Don't trust me, I don't blame you. No, if I was in your situation, I suppose I'd be just as suspicious. Goodness, it's human nature. But I'll tell you here and now, my friend, and I do think of you as my friend Smith. I like you, you know. I'll have you know I've saved your life. By having me nubbed? Asked Smith, much bewildered by the talkative attorney. Mr. Billing smiled playfully and shook his head. They knew you were in Vine Street, Smith. Who did? The two men in brown, and they'd have come to murder you if I had done nothing and left you there. Ain't they your friends then, Mr. Billing? The attorney looked about him quickly, then bent forward so his red lips were close to Smith's dusty ear, and his sharp moustache pricked and scraped almost painfully. Listen, friend, he whispered. I'll lay my cards on the table, open and above board. I'll not lie to you, for I like you. We're two of a kind, Smith, you and me. Men who know what's what in the world. Eyes open, chins up, and outface the devil. Despite himself, Smith felt flattered, for he was but 12 and small, while Mr. Billing was a grown man. He began to think less harshly of Mr. Billing. A rogue he might be, but at least he was being an open one. He did indeed lay his cards on the table, and a very grubby pack they were, though, as Mr. Billing himself pointed out with a wry laugh, all cards get soiled when you play with them. Yes, indeed, Mr. Billing and the two men in brown had once been concerned with each other. Did they have to kill the old man? Muttered Smith dismally. Were it necessary? The attorney shrugged his shoulders. Ask Mr. Black, my friend. Smith shivered, and once more his blood was uncannily chilled. Was he the other one? The one I heard? The one with the limp? More than a limp, Smith. A wooden leg. Very soft-spoken man, very devilish. I don't know I'd like to meet with Mr. Black on a dark night. The attorney paused and looked uneasily about him, as if he expected soft-spoken Mr. Black to limp out of the shadow and knife him where he sat. Right, my lad, I'll lay my cards on the table. Here Smith wondered bemusedly whether this was the same pack or a second one. That document's worth money, a vast deal of money. Enough for you and me and the chimney sweep down the road. I mean our friend, Mr. Black. For I tell you, young man, I see no way of keeping him out of it. None. He's got the pair of us, Smith. We're the little running rats, and he's the gobbling devil. If only, Smith. If only. If only what, Mr. Billing? You and me, just you and me. Where did you leave the document? Began Smith. Then something distracted him. The fettered old man was having a fit. Was he having a fit? He was banging his chained wrists down on the floor. Where, Smith, where? But Smith had suddenly thought more deeply. Lost me memory, Mr. Billing. What do you mean? Strain of waiting to be nubbed. Mr. Billing, can't remember a thing. Leastways, not a while I'm here. Don't you trust me, friend? Smith stared into the attorney's reproachful face and slowly shook his head. No, Mr. Billing, I've had enough of trust to last the rest of me life. A dreadful business had come back into Smith's small pointed face, making it seem as old as the hills. Mr. Billing's smooth cheeks seemed to pale somewhat. He murmured something about Smith sleeping on it, and that he'd see him tomorrow. Then he stood up and began to move away, trying to hold Smith's eyes till the shuffling ragbag of Newgate inhabitants got between him and his prey. For long minutes, Smith stared after him, not moving till he was taken up with the sounds of a commotion that seemed to be flowing through the prison's veins. A rumour. Dick Mulroon had been pardoned, but even before that rumour had gone its rounds, its contradiction was already at its heels. No pardon. Poor Dick Mulroon's prospects were like a wave in the sea, forever followed by its trough. 12 more days remained to him, and Mr. Jones, being Welsh and tuneful and fanciful, had already begun his Tyburn carol. On the first day of counting